I love me a good road trip movie. It's less about the big plot, more of these little adventures, these little scenes, vignettes, moving to town. Planes, trains, and automobiles, anyone? Vacation. Dumb and Dumber, good road trip movie. Pee-wee's Big Adventure, no? Forrest Gump, kind of a road movie. Smokey and the Bandit. You heard of Smokey and the Bandit? No? There's this great movie called The Straight Story. Not a lot of people have seen it. It's about this elderly man who's aged out of his driver's license. And so he uses, true story, he uses his riding lawnmower to travel a couple states to reconcile with his brother. And so we're sort of in this road trip portion of Acts, where we'll see these little vignettes, these little missionary journeys as they go from town to town. Instead of planes, trains, and automobiles, it's a little more like boats, camels, and walking, I guess. And most of the stories, there's going to be great opposition. There'll be great fruitfulness as well. But I think there's something to instruct us and inspire us, and something to apply to our own lives here. I think I told you at one point, my dad, who was in pastoral ministry for some seasons, he would read the book of Acts once a month. And I think he wanted to be reminded that this Spirit-led mission, where people were getting saved, filled with the Spirit, healed, baptized, churches being the church, it was more than just a history book, though it is that, more than just a museum piece where we get all nostalgic about how God used to move. I think he wanted to be reminded that these things were possible today. The God of Acts is the same God in 2025. Now, having said that, you don't imitate Paul exactly to have the same fruitfulness as Paul. And you may say, well, Paul started in cities, so that's where the church plants of evangelistic missions should start, as though Paul did that because he had some sort of city strategy. If he had a strategy, it was synagogues. Start in synagogues where people, fellow Jews, were already opening the Torah, seeking the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and where Paul could give them new context to the scripture that they knew so well. It just so happens synagogues were in cities. And so if we really want to imitate Paul or the principles behind Paul's strategy, then we would launch ministries where our gifts and the location match. Like, rural people need Jesus too, right? So no location is more important than any other. What we need is missionaries finding their own sweet spot for launching mission work. Lawyers with lawyers, farmers with farmers, journalists with journalists, teachers with teachers, neighbors with neighbors. So Acts 17, as was Paul's custom, he went to the synagogue service, and for 3 Sabbaths in a row, he used the scriptures to reason with the people. He explained the prophecies and proved that the Messiah must suffer and rise from the dead. He said, "This Jesus I'm telling you about is the Messiah." And so he tells them about Jesus. He deliberates and discusses and debates for 3 successive weeks in the Sabbath service. And verse 4 says the investment paid off, and it convinced some converts, both Jews and Greeks, and says prominent women. And in Thessalonica, some of his opponents were passionately, violently against what he was doing. So they incited a bit of a populist insurrection against Paul, against Silas. But when they went looking for them, they didn't find Paul or Silas, but only this guy Jason. You didn't know there was a Jason in the Bible, did it? Yo, Jason. Doesn't sound like the Bible, but they nabbed Jason and other believers in their home, and they dragged them into public with this exaggerated accusation that they were turning the world upside down, verse 6 says. Maybe that wasn't an exaggeration, actually. Wouldn't it be something if we were accused, angrily accused here at NAC, of turning the world upside down? Of course, Paul would argue, and I think we would, is that through Jesus, we're trying to turn the world right side up. And you remember John Lewis, the great civil rights leader from the 60s and into the 2000s, used to talk about getting into good trouble for all the right reasons, trouble that will cost you something, but history will look back on it as the right kind of trouble. That's what's happening in Thessalonica, some good trouble, but trouble nonetheless. They are all guilty of treason against Caesar, for they profess allegiance to another king named Jesus. I don't think they or we are meant to start a gospel conversation in a combative way necessarily. But those opposed to the gospel have made it combative. They've made it downright confrontational. And I suppose the gospel message that if Jesus is the one Lord, it must mean Caesar is not. That's a form of poking the bear. And anyone who knows anything about tyrants, especially ancient Roman ones, know well that they don't take kindly to rivals on the stage. They're poking the bear of politics and nationalism and culture. By the way, here's Paul, a Roman citizen. Is he being a disloyal citizen preaching about a different king? I guess it depends on what sort of king he thought Jesus really was. It's easy to quote Jesus' famous saying, my kingdom is not of this world. But what John actually wrote was, my kingdom is not from this world. And with the clear implication that Jesus' kingdom was definitely for this world. And the story ends here in Acts without much resolution. The authorities release Jason, and the others, and at night they urge Paul and Silas to vamoose, move on, get out of Dodge. Nice synagogue here. I'd hate to see anything happen to it, kind of thing. And so unfortunately, Paul and Silas have to escape under the cover of night, leaving behind this young, small church for whom Paul clearly has some love and affection for. And actually, interestingly, this experience and his affection for this church is reflected in Paul and Silas and Timothy's first letter back to Thessalonians, in a letter in the Bible called 1 Thessalonians. Yeah, like you thought it was a trick question. So that's right, 1 Thessalonians, it was written apparently just a few weeks after his departure here. So now we're back on the road trip. We are in Berea. And it's like, rinse and repeat situation. Straight to the synagogue to launch a gospel mission. And what's different here is that instead of violent opposition in Berea that led to being, chased out of the city, Paul's Jewish audience here responds differently. They listened to Paul. No doubt they asked him plenty of questions, and they probed the scriptures to see if Paul's message lined up with the Bible. What a relief to find some people who are actually prepared to say, well, we haven't ever thought of that before. But let's have a look at the scriptures to see if it's true. I mean, that is all a preacher can ask for, Don't take it from me. Go home, study the scriptures, see for yourself if it all lines up. The theologian and author Scott McKnight, he writes about having studied Jewish conversions to Jesus as Messiah. And I know there are people in this room, like Noella, like Cheryl, like the Wallers, who have a real heart for evangelizing our Jewish brothers and sisters. And you know what Scott McKnight noticed in this study? The average convert, Jewish convert, requires 7 years to consider, reconsider again. And they study and they ask questions and they probe the scriptures, but it takes a long while of intense investigation for a Jewish person to come to the conclusion that Jesus of the Christians is in fact Israel's Messiah. And the fundamental challenge and why it takes so long to convert is more about Jewish identity, about being part of a tribe, a family tradition, a tight community and culture. And does coming to an epiphany about Jesus as the fulfilled Messiah mean a loss of that identity? It means making new traditions, maybe being part of a new community and a culture that is very foreign and unacceptable to the people they belong to. It would truly be a death to self, a death to the old identity. You can understand why it's such a serious change, not just philosophically or theologically, but in every possible way. I'm sure some of us know what it's like to be mocked in your family as the crazy Christian weirdo. But some of you know what it's like to actually lose family, lose friends, lose community. I talked to a family last week who have lost relationships because of choosing Jesus over the Eastern religion they were raised in. And Jesus said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the essence was, sometimes I will be the source of division. Lines in the sand will be drawn because of me. I want to bring peace, but my message is one that sometimes creates clear sides. Caesar can't be king if there is already one true king. And your job can't come first if Jesus is supposed to be first. Your even family can't be more important than Jesus. It's a hard message sometimes. That is the nature of truth. If there is absolute truth, it means there are choices that are wrong. A group was so upset at Paul's message that they made their own road trip from Thessalonica all the way down to Berea to run them out of town. And that's when you know people are mad. It's not enough, for them to run you out of their town, NIMBY, not in my backyard. But when you make a road trip to kick them out of every town, that's real opposition. But notice Silas and Timothy were apparently safe enough to remain in Berea for deeper discipleship in the faith. And now in Athens, Paul is having to adapt even more in this world-class city. Yes, he launched his mission once again in a synagogue, but also in the public marketplace, as we'll see in in verse 17. In fact, he was there long enough to have formed his own tent-making business, which was also a place for conversation and gospeling to the locals. By the way, tent-making is sort of a shorthand term that we still use to this day. It's a way of saying, it's my marketplace job that funds my ministry, right? Or allows me to eat and pay the rent. But my real calling is this ministry. There have been those in NAC over the years who have done that. Most of the world does not actually have full-time pastors with a pension and a dental plan and a book allowance, right? I am part of a minority in terms of how the world supports pastors. I have a church that generously pays me to support a family. And it is incredibly humbling for me to meet some of these international pastors. Since a pastor is a calling, not a paycheck, and see the kind of impact they're having in India or Ukraine and having to support themselves on top of it. Would I be that selfless? Would I be that generous, that obedient? I sure hope so. Now, who was at our Church in the Park service this last August? Just raise your hand. You remember? Okay. Great. It was a great turnout. We're doing it again this summer. Pastor Fred will be sharing. I had talked that Sunday sort of about Acts 17, actually, because I looked at that outdoor amphitheater, and it sort of brought me to this Acts passage of Paul being in the middle of town in a very multicultural, pluralistic, tolerant, a bit pompous, but ultimately sort of lost. Frankly, it reminded me a lot of Canada in 2025, frankly. Some of you may remember Diane Scott did a bit of a character where she interrupted me and took on the role of the typical Athenian/Canadian who had a kind of relativistic, universalist, kind of spiritual but not religious kind of mentality. And I know some of you are like, who is this crazy lady interrupting my pastor? And why did they give her a mic? So we talked about this passage within the last year or so I won't get deeply into it, even though I really love it. But Paul runs into a couple of dominant philosophies of that day. He runs into the Epicureans, which simply put is a worldview all about happiness and pleasure. They held a theory according to which the world and the gods were like a long way apart from each other. They had little or no communication. So what we should do is get on with life as best we could. Might as well eat, drink, be merry, get maximum pleasure out of life because we're kind of alone here. The Stoics, however, believed that divinity could be found in this world, within nature, within the clouds, within each human being. This was not so much a personal God, more of a divine force that could be discovered and harnessed. Does this sound a little familiar in 2025? And here comes Paul with this wacky news about Jesus and the resurrection. He talks about in verse 18. And they're intrigued. So they invite him to a public lecture at one of Athens' famed legal locations. I always pronounce this wrong. Areopagus? Thank you, Don. And it still exists. Actually, just put that picture back on. If you were to visit Greece, that's a modern picture. Across the way, you can see the Acropolis. But this was like a meeting place, a speaker's corner of sorts, a place where disputes were settled and new ideas were talked about. Think of it like TED Talk on the rocks or something. And in those days, there's no Twitter, there's no TV, there's no social media, maybe only the occasional public theater, but one could find these regular public speakers giving speeches in public places like this. Going to a public speech in the first century was sort of the entertainment. Probably still shorter than the Joe Rogan podcast, too. So this place that is a mix of our parliament buildings meets the Supreme Court, meets Speaker's Corner, is set on a rock, and it could look down on the marketplace. And across, you can see the Acropolis as well, and these spectacular temples. And maybe the invitation was not as friendly or as innocuous as it sounds. Maybe they're trying to set Paul up as a fool or someone who will offend the culture and get in trouble. Because in verse 18 of the NLT, they call Paul a babbler, literally translated as a word scatterer. It's a term pretty full of contempt. And they infer that he's preaching about foreign gods, which, famously their own Socrates, the greatest philosopher of all time, had been tried and condemned on that very same charge. Athens may have been interested in new ideas, but divinities from elsewhere, that could easily get you into trouble, serious trouble. Especially if that someone proclaiming these ideas was talking about or starting a secret society with mysteries only open to the converts. The people in Athens are asking, are we permitted to know about this new teaching? It's a little weird and sarcastic. Are you allowed to tell us your little secret doctrines, or are they just for, those who you collect in your dangerous little gang? In other words, are you a danger to our state? So here for the first time in Acts, Paul took his message into the public sphere. And it's a sphere of intellectual debate. And it really set the context for Christian intellectuals doing the same thing to this day. Organizations like Reasons to Believe, having spirited debates about the veracity of our Christian claims. And I just want you to notice a couple of the best practices or principles that Paul seems to utilize in this public address, which I would call seeker-friendly or winsome or inviting to skeptics. He strikes the right tone. He shows an awareness of the philosophies of the area. He doesn't come in sort of like somebody late to a meeting, right? Who's like doesn't have context for what came before. He just jumps into it. No, he understands the culture here in Athens. And Paul, a very educated man, doesn't come in ignorantly. When I was younger, I used to think Paul was being sarcastic when he comes across this verse about an unknown God. It's like, oh, wow. I see you guys are so religious. You even have an idol to the unknown God. Way to cover your bases, guys. I was probably projecting my own sarcasm onto Paul. I think Paul is legitimately affirming something in them, opening the conversation, finding points of solidarity, making connections. He quotes their theology, and he reframes it for the gospel. We are God's offspring, says in verse 28. But he also courageously, boldly, unapologetically calls out their sin, their idolatries. He even speaks with some urgency. In verse 30, he says, look, God overlooked your ignorance in generations past. You didn't even know. But now God has been revealed in person, and you can't blame ignorance anymore. It's time to repent. It's time to turn away from your sins. According to Paul, the main thing that God was doing in Athens was shaking his head in sorrow and warning them of imminent judgment, because Athens is full of temples, and the local people were constantly bringing sacrifices and offerings to gods and goddesses and every possible kind. But the God who made the whole world, Paul declares, he doesn't live in houses made by human hands. And maybe even with a wave of his hands, he gestures towards the Parthenon standing majestically in the background, as it still does today. One of the wonders of the architectural world and one of the most beautiful buildings ever built. But Paul's like, yeah, nice job, but it misses the point. And as for bringing animal sacrifices to the true God, well, this is the wrong way around. Like, it is he who gives everything to us, not the other way around. And all these lifeless idols, I don't care whether they're gold or silver or whatever, they are definitely missing the point. So they too are just merely a sign of ignorance, of blundering humans sensing a presence, a divinity, recognizing there's something spiritual in them and in the world, but not really knowing what to do about it. So folks, God has now brought this time of ignorance to an end, Paul says. Turn away from these things. Give them up. Shake yourself free of them and instead turn to the living God. If you seek for him, you will find him, verse 27 says. Leave behind the philosophies, the pseudo-intellectuals, the religious rubbish that humans manufacture. There is a living God, and he is now calling everyone, everywhere. He's like, I know you Epicureans. I know some of you are here today think, God or the gods are too far away to care. But Paul says, God is very close to us. The giver of everything is near. He is a passionate seeker who wants you to seek him. And despite what you've been told and taught, this God actually longs for a relationship of love with all his human creatures. This would be new to the Epicurean thinker. Good news, I would imagine, at least good enough to want to hear more. And to the Stoic, by contrast, Paul might say, yes, you're right. There is a spark of the divine in all of us. We are created in the imago Dei, the very image of God, but we are not gods. We take on the character and identity of God when we surrender to him and allow his spirit into our heart and our life. And unfortunately, I think the average Athenian at that time, maybe the typical Canadian at this time, sort of played it more like a spiritual smorgasbord, little this, a smidgen of that, an idol to an unknown God just to keep my bases covered. There's a world of difference between the seeker who says, we'll never know anything about God or the gods, and actually, I'm quite okay with that. I'm just going to offer a lamb on this altar once a year, just in case, and I hope that does whatever needs doing because I'd rather live my life my own way. Versus someone who says, I can't help but believing that there must be somewhere some divine being who is actually more than we have realized. So I'm keeping the windows of my heart open, and I'm hoping that one day I'll find out. And maybe some of you are like that here this morning. The first we might call a closed agnosticism. We don't know, we can't know, and I like it that way. And the second we might call more of an open agnosticism, or even humble agnosticism. Like, we don't seem to know at present, but that means it's possible that there's something more that we could know. And I would love to know if we could know. Actually, you could call the first inconsistent agnosticism, since it professes absolute certainty that we can't know anything, which is paradoxical to say the least. But the second case could be called consistent agnosticism, being agnostic about agnosticism itself. So he sees this idol, this statue, to an unknown God. Apparently this is the what's left of that original statue or idol. And he says, guess what? You can actually know this God. And this God can know you. And the days of being blissfully ignorant about it are over. I'm happy to say that there were a couple of conversions recorded in Athens. One named Dionysus, another a woman named Damaris, and Luke records there were others with them. But clearly, this is hard gospel soil. It just is. Canada is hard gospel soil. Mars Hill does remind me of Canada in a lot of ways. And later in Acts, Paul will be witnessing before kings and governors. And one of them sort of brushes off Paul. He says, come back at a more convenient time with this Jesus message. And Paul is like, and this would be my closing words to you today. Now, today is the accepted time of God's salvation. The God who is seeking you, wooing you, knocking on the door of your heart. Today is the accepted time. But only if you're prepared, I suppose, to take the radical step of making him King, Lord of your life. Let me invite the team to come, and we're going to finish this 7 Sundays of taking communion together. And I'm going to invite you today, maybe even in the quiet of your reflection as you hold these elements, to say yes to King Jesus, to truly make him the king of your life. I'm amazed reading the Gospels how people laid out their cloaks and said, "Blessed he who comes in the name of the Lord, King Jesus." About a week later, I suspect some of those same people were shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." Whatever sort of the will of the crowd was on any given day. And I'm asking you today that you would not be fickle in this, that you would not go where the crowd goes on any given day, but that you would commit to King Jesus.